way. So first of all, I want to set the background to our Parsha more conceptually, and then realizing we have veterans and newcomers here, and set up the internal development of the story just a bit, and then get to a few other points. You'll see in Aviva Zornberg's treatment of the narrative that she herself refers to the Sfat Emet, my favorite Hasidic commentary on the Torah. Here's what the text looks like on the outside. Sfat Emet, the language of truth. This is the book, the name given by the author, Yehuda Leib Alter, died in 1905, to his text. And he was a person who wanted to focus on the inner life dimension, what I'll call the truth dimension of what's happening in the deeper subterranean levels of the text. So from the perspective of Sfat Emet and a certain reference in Aviva Zornberg, he says that this Torah portion is mostly about what he says is truth or emet. So I want to just read a bit of that section to you. Let's see here. Hold on a second. My bookmark was in the wrong place. So what do we mean by truth? So I want to take a long step back and ask us from an inner life, more philosophic perspective, a meaning of the word truth. So a meaning of the word truth here is, what is the truth of what is happening among the brothers? It's an interesting usage of the word truth, but probably one of the most important. And in some way, this is a commentary on our talk last night. Shanti's poem by Yehuda Amichai introduced this idea. It fit nicely within my presentation of the Goodwill by Roberto Saggioli. And one thing we mean by truth is a person, what Saggioli calls natural self-centeredness. Now, selfishness is that you look out for your own interests, and that's entirely natural, and we can regulate that. It's much harder to regulate what we call self-centeredness, because self-centeredness means my moral perspectives, my understanding of life, my understanding of others, of the human condition, is based in an internal narrative that seems logical, that seems rational, that seems well-intentioned, that has a ring of truth to it, and we operate within that realm. Saggioli calls this the Earth-centric notion of the solar system, where we are at the center and everything revolves around us. This is not bad, it's entirely natural. But from a Saggioli's perspective, we have to exert what he calls the goodwill to perform within ourselves what Saggioli calls a Copernican revolution, which means not to see yourself as the center of the moral universe. You might say, to extend the metaphor, to see the sun or the light as the center of the moral universe. You are one of many people circling around the truth, trying to find your way. And as Saggioli says, when we go beyond the strong will, the skillful will, the good will is a basic existential reorientation of your life to overcome our natural self-centeredness, meaning how we understand the way things are, because we understand them as being logically right, true, valid, verifiable, and moral. And what Saggioli would have us do, and again I'm paraphrasing from the poem from last night, is introduce what Avichal said are sfekot, doubts, ve'ahavot, loves. Now Saggioli says something very, very similar, although not in a poetic fashion, although his writing does approach poetry. He says, first of all, there has to be a deep, empathetic understanding of others, which is an act of will. Not to understand them after we've judged them. Not to say, I judge you, I'm okay, you're not okay, you're bad, and now I want to give you mercy. I've already figured the whole thing out, and I will either forgive you or not forgive you. As you've heard me say many times before, forgiveness is implied you've already judged. And therefore, in order to forgive somebody, they actually have to be at fault. And sometimes we forgive people, but we don't even care enough to find out the truth of the matter, because it is perhaps they who ought to be forgiving us because we were the ones who were not righteous in a given moment. So think of the truth of the situation. The truth of the situation now here between the brothers, but we're going to expand this to our lives, where you may have an understanding of a relationship. And this could be with a spouse or an ex-spouse, a parent, a child, some other person, and you have a pretty definite point of view of what's going on. And in this truth, you may go to the side of, I'm right, they're wrong, I'm okay, they're not okay, but I'm not going to be mean and hard about it. Or maybe you have a different kind of a personality. You see yourself as the guilty one, as the one who did not do enough. And if you studied things enough and went for the truth, you might find that somebody has gaslighted you. Somebody has ambushed you. Somebody has persuaded you that you're the one at fault when actually you are not the one at fault. And when you think of some of the greatest literature that I've seen, including, great movies, great television, and sometimes B+ movies and television, where a person is persuaded that they're the one at fault because other people are conspiring to make them think that they're at fault. And one of these greatest stories is when the person suddenly discovers that they're being gaslighted, there's something else going on behind the scenes. Well, I don't want to take it to that extreme, other than to say this is what Sfat Emet seems to be saying here. We never really know the truth of the matter, and don't assume you know the truth of the matter until you do the work to find out the truth of the matter. And one of the ways you can find the truth of the matter is to give up the high perch of your assuming you have understanding of yourself, you have understanding of others, you have understanding what is at stake. And this, of course, includes escaping from our narrative. And sometimes the narrative is not a mean one. Sometimes it can sound quite high-minded. And by the way, by the end of this investigation of the truth, you might come back to, well, I think I had the pretty much correct understanding of the facts. I think I analyze this morally pretty correctly. But when you come back to that position, having worked to that position, you might say the truth you are holding is more humble. The truth you're holding is empathy for everybody here, especially those who have not lived a life of truth, and with an eye toward reconciliation. What can we possibly do? In fact, that was the part of the end of our discussion last night. Roland had a question, and the question is, when you see something going on that's not true, sometimes there's just nothing you can do. And sometimes there is a little something you can do. And each of us has to ask ourselves, if something not true, not right. I mentioned I was a court reporter for a little while when I was in the military, and I saw trials where guilt or innocence became a matter of record. It was officially true, but I happened to know from inside knowledge that it wasn't true, meaning the record was wrong. The court decided incorrectly. And then my question as a mere PFC Lance Corporal is, what do I do about that? And I'm sure you have also been in situations where you might say the record has already been set, but the record is wrong. What does one do? We talked about that a little bit last night. In any case, that's my large philosophic opening. Why is this important? What are we talking about? We're talking about you. We're talking about me. We're talking about the human condition. We think we know the truth of the matter, but we don't know the truth of the matter. And sometimes the truth of the matter emerges because people are acting with goodwill. And that's probably a key for me when I think about my life and yours. The truth of the matter emerges, A, when people are acting with goodwill, and secondly, when people are willing to accept a truth of the matter, even though it's not in their interest, even though it doesn't make them happy. From this perspective, it's far better to know the truth, even the truth that you're resisting, because once you have an understanding of the truth, you can understand what to do next. I have dozens of examples of that, but I'll maybe wait until there are any questions. So here's what Sfat Emet says. This is his drash given in 5637. This would be the 1870s. I haven't memorized these dates quite yet. And he says the following. I'll start in media res, in the middle of this. So he says, "Ubiur ha'inyan ki hine Yehuda lo chidesh davar be'ela dvarim." That the heart of the matter is when Judah is telling his story before Joseph in our chapter in Genesis 44, I think is where our story is. His confession, as it were, is taking place. Let me go ahead and turn to that because I will be referring to it. So when Judah makes this great confession before his brother in Genesis 44, what Judah says is he's recounting a story. He hasn't said anything new. So what does it mean to tell the truth when you tell a story where everything is known? Now, from my perspective, this is called what is getting down the bare bones chronology, the police report, which one has to do before you reconcile, settle anything. Make sure the facts are straight. And as he's talking to Judah, to Joseph, and his brothers are hearing, are they all saying, that's pretty much what happened? You're not giving, certainly not giving an exculpatory narrative. You're not trying to blame anybody else. You're setting out the facts. And so Sfat Emet says, he hasn't said anything new, and he has no claim yet to bring against Joseph. So he said it's kind of a neutral, but the truth is being said. He says, "Afal pichem la'asher birer amitut ha'inyan balo ha'yeshua." It says, "La'asher berur," in order to clarify amitut ha'inyan, the veracity, the truth of the matter. Balo ha-Yeshua. Salvation comes. Balo ha-Yeshua. Salvation comes to him because he's trying to establish the truth of the matter. Amitut ha-inyan. This is a profound thing, especially because Sfat Emet says, Balo ha-Yeshua, salvation. Now, oftentimes when we hear the salvation, we think of it of grand theological terms. In Christianity, one accepts the salvation of Jesus Christ and one is afforded salvation. And we say, Ushavtamayim misasom mimaneha Yeshua. We draw from the well springs of salvation, the profound healing of of God. The word salvation in English is from the word salve, a healing. And you have the sense in Hebrew as well. So there's this great idea of salvation. And one reason I love this usage is that salvation, that salve, that healing happens sometimes in the smallest moments of our lives. And I've seen this and you've seen this, just the reconciliation between two people. People in a family, people with other people. As we spoke a couple weeks ago when I brought up that book by Max Scheler, Resentment, that Max Scheler lifts to a highly philosophic part of philosophic anthropology. He says people can enter this state of resenting another person, that they can't feel whole themselves until this other person has been brought low. We see it in individuals. We see it, he actually says this 100 years ago. We see it in genders, social classes, ethnic groups, that part of their identity is this ressentiment, and then they are stuck in that until they choose to transcend it. So this idea of ressentiment, this resentment, can actually be something very damaging to one's soul and one's identity. And therefore, the way you tell the story, you can tell the story where you become the person of resentment, or you can tell the story in another way where you are released from resentment and the other person is released from your judgmentalism. Now, I've seen this happen between people. I've seen this happen in so many different ways. I just have to share with you on the political level. I shared this story a few times. Back when I was at USC, I was in the Students for Israel, and we oftentimes had shouting matches with the pro-Palestinian group. We'd be on the Tommy Trojan, they'd be on Tommy Trojan, and things would get heated. And one time they had a big demonstration, and we responded, and we were crowding up against each other, and students were crowding up against each other, and this one guy about my age, Egyptian, was really hot, and I was pushing back, and we were like face to face. And the only reason we didn't come to blows is our arms were trapped by the crowd around us, and people pulled us apart. I was just not going to let anybody get away with saying such horrible things about Jews in Israel. It's like I thought to myself, okay, that's over. And, whatever he was thinking, he was thinking something similar. And I saw him a while later. And I was keeping my eye on the other side, and they had somebody giving a talk about something like, you should buy Israeli stamps because we're going to destroy Israel soon, and Israeli stamps are going to grow up in value. So I'm listening. I said, yeah, okay, just want to make sure I'm not plotting anything. And I leave, and he's there. And he walks out with me. And I said to him, well, you must really like that. He says, not really. I said, what? He said, nah. I said, should we talk? He goes, yeah. So it turns out we're the same age. He was in the Egyptian army when I was in the U.S. military. I was in the Marine Corps when the 73 war broke out. He was a lieutenant in the Egyptian army, was wounded by the Israelis, nursed hatred in his heart. We sat down and he said, those kinds of talks will never bring peace. By the way, this was right around the time that Sadat had gone to Jerusalem to meet with Golda Meir. So I think there's something in the air. Not that everybody went with it. Remember, Sadat was assassinated. But he said, I've thought about it. I don't want to continue this. And we really connected. We had a really beautiful connection. Last night, Shanti told a story about a woman who reached out to a neo-Nazi. I've shared stories of other people. But that moment when, for the truth of the matter at one moment was we want to kill each other because we're standing for two oppositional ideas. I have to say I've always been a moderate on these things, a Palestinian state if Israel can live within secure and secure, fair, and firm boundaries. He was more on the side that Israel had no right to exist, and that was it. It was implacable. That was the truth of the matter. Something happened. We sat down, and we bonded deeply. Not so much that we agreed where the final border should be, but we agreed that the hatred was not the way. And so the truth here became the truth there. When I looked at him and said, well, I guess you liked that lecture. I wasn't mean to him. I just kind of threw it out as a kind of a bid, and he took the bid, and we saw each other on occasion until he went back to Egypt. Lost contact, I'm sorry to say, no internet in those days. So he says, the biur amitut ha'inyan balo ha'yeshua. By the word berur is a Kabbalistic idea of what it means to release the sparks from the husks. So sometimes the Sfat Emet does not admit to us how much the Lurianic Kabbalah is operating inside his text, but from a Kabbalistic perspective, the reconciliation between Judah and Joseph is exactly an example of releasing a spark. The husk is the resentment, the pain, the tragedy of Joseph, the hatred and resentment of the brothers, selling him, throwing him in the pit, selling him into slavery, Joseph's time in jail, the incredible suffering of Jacob, the unimaginable suffering of Jacob. All this comes together, you might say, a husk, with another layer and another layer and another layer, but there's a spark inside. There's a spark inside of truth and reconciliation. And the question is, how does that husk become broken? How do we break the husk and release the spark? Well, in Lurianic and Hasidic spiritual psychology, is called berur. Livarer literally means to clarify, but has a special meaning, which means to break the husk, and livarer, to allow the spark to become, quote unquote, clarified, and then and restore the broken vessels of the divine. So Sfat Emet calls this moment a Yeshua, a salvation. And there's no better word for it. There's no better word when one can overcome all the pain and all the tragedy and be an agent of the Yeshua, of the salvation, as it were, in the sense of breaking a husk and releasing a spark, especially for relationships. And I want to say, thinking a little bit back to the Torah portion Vayishlach, where the Ish, whom I assume is Esav, blesses Yaakov. And by the way, God also blesses Yaakov with the name change a little bit later. It's not as dramatic as when the Ish does, whom I assume to be Esav. And why does this Ish, Esav, do this? Because Jacob is so in need of a blessing, the blessing from his brother. And I always extend this to mean that one of our daily meditations is, who needs a blessing from us? Whose identity cannot be full unless they receive our blessing? When you look at yourself, in what way is your identity not full? Because you haven't had the blessing of, let's say, some given person. And what it would mean for you to say to somebody and say, after all these years, I need your blessing that we're okay. Or that somebody comes to you. So this idea that we live our lives without a core blessing that will help heal us, the idea that can be a releasing of the spark. And in the same way that these brothers reconcile, I'm thinking of the hidden blessings that we have for each other and that we withhold from each other, and how deeply this is part of the archetypal story of Genesis, is what it means to actually bless another person. When we bless them, we, as it were, give them a new name. We restore an identity to them, or we grant them an identity toward which they are seeking. So Sfat Emet goes on, V'ha'emet ki kol parasha zo mi Yosef ve'achav. So the truth is that this is the truth is all about Joseph and his brothers. V'hu mashal avodat b'nei Yisrael HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is analogous to the worship that the people of Israel do to God. So this moment of reconciliation, this moment of amitut hadabar, the truth of the moment, he says, this is like worshiping God. This is worshiping God. So when people say, how does one worship God? Sfat Emet would say, reconcile with somebody. That's an act of worship with God. And now he's referring to something else. He says, Kasher hachamim hagidu oy lanu miyom hadin. When the sages say, and he's quoting from a rabbinic text here, oy lanu miyom hadin, we're so afraid of the judgment day because none of us can withstand the judgment of the divine. We see what the law asks of us. We see the way that we fall short. So he quotes many texts, and he finally says that when we find ourselves in that place where you say to yourself, I don't live up to the standard of menschlichkeit. I don't live up to the standard of what a person ought to do. He goes on and talks about the idea that even though God's glory fills the earth, he says, "V'gam hamakom hachashuch sham nistar kavod Adonai." In the darkest places is where the glory and honor of God resides. So interestingly, when a person says, "Oy lanu," woe for us, I can't measure up to what's expected of me, and you go to a very dark place, Sfat Emet says, that's exactly where the honor and glory and light of God is found. You might say I was studying New Testament this week, still studying after my Christmas afternoon talk. I was studying the book of Letter to the Romans of Paul, where he articulates a very foundation of Christian theology, which is that the law is there to accuse us, to show you that you cannot be justified by law. So when you examine the law, you're ashamed, and then the gracious gift is given to you because you can't work yourself, you can't justify yourself in the face of the law. So the law's function is to accuse, and then grace is given. Of course, Paul studied with Jewish masters in first century Judaism. It's not a completely alien thought to me, except I would say Jewish thought, including Pharisaic thought, is just a bit more complex. It is true that when I studied law and it says, love my neighbor as myself, do not hold grudges, love God with all my heart, soul, and might. Yes, I know I can't live up to that. But the place that it takes me to is exactly where you find the majesty and light of God. It's not to say I'm utterly cut off from God. This is from a Jewish perspective, and I need some extraordinary act from God, a blood sacrifice of the Son of God. That's not what Judaism teaches. It says when you go to that deep, dark place and say, I'm not achieving it. I have to share with you, on my birthday, someone sent me a message and says, something like, just know the best that you're doing the best you can and you're working as hard as you can. And I thought, man, I'm not going to say anything. And I wrote the person back and I said, I actually have the opposite one. It says, I'm not doing the best I can, and I know I'm not working as hard as I can. I'm not going to lie. Am I really doing the best I can? I don't think so. I actually think I can do a little bit better. Am I working as hard as I can? I see gaps. I can see myself. So if I look at what I think is expected of me, and I can say to myself, I don't think I'm working as hard as I can, and I don't think I'm doing the best I can. Well, now what? So now I have to face my resistance. Who is that in there, that resistance that is saying, nah, I'm not going to let you work as hard as you can, and I'm not going to let you do your best you can. I'm going to limit you. And now I found the resistance. And so how do I fight the resistance, the big R, the Yetzer Hara? I can see it operating within me. In that darkness that I feel, that I want to do the best that I can. I want to work as hard as I can, and he seems to be foiling me. Sfat Emet says we go down to this world where nistar kavod malchuto, that the honor, glory of God is hidden. And he says, quoting here from Psalms, Gam hachoshech lo yachshich mimcha, but the darkness will not obscure it from you. So this is a promise given to God from Psalms 119:12. Hachoshech lo yachshich mimcha, even the darkness will not occlude from you, will not obscure for you the light that is even hidden in the deep darkness. So he goes on in this matter. Just the last thing I'll say is, Lezot bechol et tzara, in every difficult moment, keshadam mevatel atzmo, when a person voids oneself, el ha'emet, to the truth, u'misirut nefesh, and when turns over the soul to the truth, like Judah did, he says, then the darkness is lifted. So the darkness puts us in the moment where you say to yourself, I got to find my way out of here. There's, as it were, some detectable honor and glory of God. So what do? You surrender to the truth of the matter. Because one reason we're in the darkness from Sfat Emet's point of view is here because we haven't surrendered to the truth. We're holding on to some narrative that just dims the light. So when you're in their darkness, the darkness, hachoshech lo yachshich, the darkness is not going to occlude the truth from you. You're there because you won't admit the truth. And then he says, if we are like Yehudah, now remember, what is the etymology of the Hebrew word Yehudah? Lehodot, which means to acknowledge. Lehodot means to confess. Lehodot means to thank. All three words in one word root in Hebrew, which is the shorish, the word root of the word Yehudah. Lehodot, to acknowledge, to admit. Lehodot, to confess. Lehodot, to be grateful. Todah comes from this, the vidui, the confession, they all come from the word Yehudah. Now, many people say, is this in the back of the mind of the authors of this book? Because if there's any archetypal exemplar of these three phases of the human inner life, of confession, acknowledgement, and thanks, it would be Judah. It's strange for me to think that the name of this character that was given to him way back when Jacob was living with Rachel and Leah and Lavan, if that was on the author's mind, if so, I'm just going to give more credit to this amazing author. Anyway, he just goes on in this vein. It's so beautiful, and I don't think I saw this before. In overreading Zornberg, she just mentioned, put a little note in. I went back to the note, and she says, Sfat Emet 5637. I pulled out my Sfat Emet. I read it. Wow, just another deep dive into this. All right, so my first paragraph of thought is, we've discussed the Parsha analysis in years past. I think I'm going to end up putting some of that stuff online, but today I wanted to give you the philosophic understanding of what is happening here. And now a little bit of Parsha analysis, and then I'm going to ask Sherry if she has a comment and see if there are any questions. So what is the thing that is happening here? What is the truth that is happening here? Of course, the truth that is happening here that we spoke in last week's Torah portion is the truth that all of this pain, resentment, hatred, and envy, where it led Reuben, Judah, and the other brothers against Joseph. I revised my thinking, as I put in my Shabbat thought. I think all the time that I've been doing Jewish spiritual psychology, archetypal psychology, I've seen Joseph as the grandiose one. And because I've been reading a book about Joseph perhaps being on the Asperger's spectrum, and a person making a very good case for that, by the way, which I'd like to teach us sometime. Many people were very moved by that and said, could you teach this book? Because many people have children on the spectrum. They are on the spectrum. And the idea that one way to understand Joseph is he has charismatic gifts. He can read a dream, but it's hard for him to read other people. And I have a book series that I quite enjoy. It's a comedy drama on exactly such a person who has charismatic gifts, has trouble reading other people. And it's a bit comedic, the trials and tribulations of this person, but there's a tragedy on the other side of it. Because some of the situations in which this person finds himself could have gone very, very badly had there not been somebody nearby, his wife, somebody else that could pull him out. I just want to give you one tiny example. His wife was in this book called The Rosie Project. His wife was pregnant. He realized he had no idea how to be a father. He's in New York City. So he gets his camera out and he goes down to the playground and he begins to film all the parents with their little children and gets arrested and taken to the police. And they say, what are you doing? He says, well, I want to photograph little children. And you can see this thing getting worse. And on one hand, it's comedic. On the other hand, just imagine not quite knowing what's up, and suddenly with a very aggressive, unkind, maybe brutal police officer, and your life is in their hands, and you can't explain yourself fully. By the way, I watch a lot of courtroom TV and police interactions. It happens, and it's terrifying for me to think of a person who can't read other people suddenly finding themselves in the grip of the law, in the grip of the legal system. It actually is kind of terrifying. So since seeing this book by Samuel Levine, and by the way, he reached out to me, he says, please, you're going to love my book, please read it. So I finally did. I contacted him. It's an amazing book, thank you, and we'll study it. I've reevaluated Joseph, and Joseph is, for me, the person with charismatic gifts who can't read the world and finds himself in the worst situations. And maybe in his reflection in prison, I used to think he was coming to terms with his grandiosity. Now I think he's coming to terms with, I have to learn how to read people. I did not know I was this hated. I didn't know how much my brothers hated me until they threw me into the bottom of a pit. That's when I got it. What do I do? How can I? Now, I no longer see this as a moral flaw, as a character flaw, but as it were, not even a tragic flaw in the Aristotelian sense, but rather just as a disability. Some kind of intellectual personality disability, not functioning, you might say, as mainstream as another, and the terrible place that it took him. And maybe even his brother's hatred was about Joseph didn't know how to talk to them. He didn't know how to talk about his charismatic gift with them. He was clueless. He thought they would all want to know what his dreams were about. So that's part of this tragedy. The hatred of the brothers is part of the tragedy. Of course, Joseph being lifted out and arranging for the salvation of the known world on one hand. On the other hand, we see back at the farm Jacob and his terrible suffering, the great guilt by the brothers. Again, I think of Jacob's guilt that he has nightmares the whole 20 years he's with Lavan about what he did to his brother. I have a similar image of Joseph's brothers having nightmares for all these years, what they did to their brother. And we see a structural similarity of what Jacob did to Esau and what Joseph's brothers did to Joseph for almost the exact same reasons. And so another generation goes by, and all of this is now brought to a head here. Just one last thing, based on my playful parsha that I gave, that I've issued it another year because sometimes I'm not done with these interpretations. I shape them a little bit. But I remember last year, 2 years ago, I think this was in the beginning of COVID when I remember saying to myself, I want to deepen the teaching, and part of what deepening the teaching means is studying more, and sometimes what part of the deepening of the teaching means is contemplate more. And I remember in my contemplation, I sat and I thought about this, and I thought, there's something happening in the background here, and it has to do. I'll end here and take a few thoughts. What I call the mystery of consciousness. I'm rereading a book by Daniel Siegel, whom I greatly admire, on the nature of the mind, and it's a really brilliant book. But one thing that he doesn't come quite close enough to, nor does anybody, by the way, nobody can tell us what consciousness is, especially, let's say, to be conscious of the inner life. Okay, and that's not a hard one. Daniel Siegel talks about this. To not only have emotions, but to be conscious of your emotions. Not only to be in a subjective state, to be aware of your subjective state. No longer be shaped by forces going on inside of you and outside of you as your mind tries to interpret them, but be aware of your mind interpreting the external world. Be aware of how your mind is assembling information. I would add to this, be aware how all of this subjectivity and objectivity and intrapsychology, interpersonal psychology, how all of this is creating a kind of a knowledge. I would add to it an obligation. It's a very hard thing to account for psychologically, is when all of your rumination turns into an obligation. Now, this is not the obligation of the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not an intellectual achievement. It says, well, I need to do this because it's the greatest good for the greatest number. Sometimes when I land on a moral obligation, that's the last thing on my mind. When I look at my subjective state, look at myself objectively, watch myself process all of this information, and I try to sit with it, sometimes what comes out of it is I have an obligation to do something. I have an obligation not to do something. And it's as if all that contemplation, it sharpens into do my duty. What ought I do? What is the most important thing ought I do? Sometimes it's a spiritual obligation to get on with my life. Sometimes it's a moral obligation with another person. There's all kinds of things. So that's one thing that happens. When you sit and observe this whole thing that Daniel Siegel recommends is a moral obligation. And the question is, where does that come from? Meaning, let's say something in me can activate a higher state of consciousness to do this reflective work. Who's that? Who is it within me that drew some part of me to the observer mind? Who's drawing that out? And as all that work gets done, and some higher consciousness has drawn me into the observer mind, and then I arrive at a duty, well, then there's something above that. Because there's something that knows what a moral duty is. There's something, as it were, that guided the part of me that drove me into the observer mind. So something pulled me into the observer mind. Let's say this. What had that draw me into the observer mind? Like, there's like the great mystical chain of being. And when I arrive on what is my duty, obviously there's some moral reality hovering around in consciousness that I didn't know I had that duty until I did all this work. Where'd that come from? And how did that suddenly arrive? Well, I'm giving this as an analogy. I think that should be familiar to all of you. It's an analogy of insight. So when I remember studying the Parsha, and all of a sudden, it's as if it came to me. They say, Kedavar Mugmar, as a finished thing, the ghost of Rachel is everywhere in the story. I never thought it before, never thought it out. It's one of those, it's a soul knowledge. Something just got delivered up from my soul, the ghost of Rachel. Now, why the ghost of Rachel? Because I thought of Joseph's trauma of his young mother dying in childbirth. I thought of Benjamin never knowing his mother. One could say Rachel's birthing of Benjamin is what killed Rachel. I think of Jacob's devastation of losing his beloved wife. We all go back to the story, all of us who know the text, when Rachel is trying to protect her husband from her bad guy father Laban, and so she steals Lavan's teraphim, his godlets that were his source of power, at least mythically, and she hides them. And what does Jacob do? He says, "Whoever has the teraphim, let that person be put to death." Who quotes Jacob? Judah. Judah says, "Whoever has that goblet, let the person be put to death." Now, we, the readers, know that Rachel has hidden the teraphim back in, I'm going to say Genesis, well, it's in 29 or 30. The reader's horrified because when Jacob says, "Let that be person to death," there's this horrible sinking feeling that we have that Jacob has just sentenced Rachel to death. Why did Rachel steal her father's teraphim? To protect her husband from Laban's witchcraft. And then you see that almost those exact words repeated by Joseph. In fact, let me just go back just for a second. I think this is going to be over in the story when they are. If you want to go with me, I'll be ending very quickly here. Go back to chapter 31, verse 31. In 29:30, "Why did you steal my gods?" Lavan says. "Lama ganavta et Elohai." Why did you steal my gods? "Vaya'an Yaakov, vayomer Lavan." And Jacob's answer, speaking to Laban. First, Jacob says, "Here's why I took off. Because I was afraid, I thought perhaps you might steal your daughters from me. With whomever you find your gods, that person shall not live." So he says, "Im asher timsa et Elohecha, lo yihye, neged achinu haker lecha ma imadi." In the presence of our kinsmen, ascertain yourself what is with me. Hakerna. Hakerna. Now, other years we've done the entire Dvar Torah on Hakerna. Take a look. This is what these words are spoken between Isaac and Jacob. The words, of course, are throughout our Torah portions, Miketz and here. This idea, Hakerna, look, recognize. Now, the truth of look, recognize, I mean, just think about it. That he says, Hakerna, there's nothing here. Well, there is something there. The truth of the matter, there is something there. Now, even back in the Isaac and Jacob story, when he says, Hakerna, I'm Esau. Actually, he wasn't Esau. So throughout this story, and we've done this other years, and perhaps next year I'll give up. I won't do a philosophic introduction, and I won't do the Ghost of Rachel. We'll just maybe repeat that, because it's a stunning way that the author of the Bible weaves narratives together in one term, Hakerna, where everything is woven together. To the point that it says that Joseph hitnaker, he didn't want to allow his brothers to see him. When the brothers kill the animal and say, Hakerna, is this not Joseph's coat? And look at this blood on it. So this idea, lahakir, which means to know, to be familiar with, is so often used. Look at this, it's a lie. Look at this, it's a lie. And then finally, there's this great resolution. So my main purpose was today, assuming that you all can look at the Parsha, you can all read Zornberg, was to take one little footnote of Zornberg, track it down to the Sfat Emet, and bring that out in full view, this idea that the truth of a situation is oftentimes hidden in the darkness. And we have to go into that darkness, this berur, this, as it were, breaking through the husk and living a spark. Why? I'm going to try to pull this all together. Because we want to be people of goodwill. Because we want to be agents of salvation and transformation. And therefore, we have to subjugate our natural, what Assagioli calls self-centeredness, perform an internal Copernican revolution, and be agents of the truth in our lives.